So John Stuart Mill, the utilitarian philosopher, says that the consequences determine the morality of an action, not the motive. But he does tell us the motive is very relevant to the morality of the person doing the action. If you want to assess the morality of a person, you do need to look at the motive. But to assess the morality of an action, all that matters is the consequences. Well, according to popular, simple interpretations of Mill, what this means is that we ignore the rules. In any situation, we just do what leads to the good consequences. Well, I don't think that's true at all. First of all, Mill himself says the rules do matter. You see, we have fundamental principles and principles derived from them. Fundamental moral principles are principles like happiness is valuable and human intellectual pleasures are superior to animal physical pleasures. This comes straight from Mill's book, Utilitarianism. Those are the fundamental principles. But in the same book, he tells us there are principles derived from this. Principles like don't lie, don't kill, don't steal, don't cheat, follow the golden rule, do to others what you want them to do to you, and even the categorical imperative and moral principles from Aristotle. These are received moral principles. And Mill says we've received them because in human history, they have a good track record of contributing to happiness. So by all means, keep them. And if you follow them nearly all the time, you'll do just fine. You don't need to look at fundamental principles very often. You just need to look at the derived principles. That'll tell you what you need to do 90-something% of the time, probably 99 point something, maybe 99.9 something. The received principles, all these received rules will tell us what is right, and they rarely let us down. They rarely give us wrong answers, and they rarely give us any genuine dilemmas. When those happen, we do need to look to the fundamental principles to make our decisions. But most of the time, the rules are just fine. Now, what about a scenario where a rule seems to conflict with happiness? Let's say I'm a judge, and I observe that the defendant in a particular case is clearly guilty according to the law. But it's not at all fair. The person is the rare case in 100 where a pretty good law, a pretty useful law, caused trouble to an innocent person. Maybe he was an innocent bystander and just sort of got caught in a tragic situation. And because of what he did in this situation, he's technically, having violated the law, guilty. But he didn't do anything morally wrong, and you'd really hate to punish him for it. But the law does stipulate there has to be a punishment. So what does the judge do? Pop utilitarianism says the judge should declare him innocent, set him free. Pop Kantianism says stick with the rules, rule of law. What would happen if judges always used their own discretion? It'd be rule of judges, not rule of law. We want rule of law. Rule of law is good. Therefore, judge condemns him and just doesn't have to care about the consequences. Well, I think Mill says actually probably the same thing as Kant here. What Mill says is the real consequences, the big ones. Don't just look at the immediate consequences of the unjust suffering of this particular individual. Look at the consequences to damaging the rule. There's a rule here. Well, there's really two rules. There's the rule that's in the law, and there's the rule that is law is good. And then in another sense of the term, there's the principle that the rule of law is good. The rule of law is good. And if a judge doesn't apply it, he's going to be undermining the rule of law. So I think Mill says, unless you know a little more about the situation, probably the damage done to the rule of law is going to be a worse consequence than the damage done to this poor innocent victim. The judge should apply the law. Rule of law is a bigger consequence. And any time someone makes this kind of decision, supporting a rule, even though there are in the short term negative consequences, I think Mills thinks that's the right thing to do. As long as the undermining of the rule by seeking short-term good consequences would be worse than the short-term bad consequences involved in upholding the rule. And how often is that? Well, it's probably very often. I believe in rule of law. So if I find myself in Pakistan, where I could download movies illegally, and I have a very good chance of not getting in any kind of trouble for it. Should I do it? Pop Mill says, sure, go with the happy consequences. Popcon says, no, categorical imperative. Well, I think if you look at Mill more closely, you might see he says, upholding the rule of law leads to some really good consequences. Is my small contribution to the rule of law in upholding the rule of law by not downloading movies illegally, even if I could get away with it, is that small contribution bigger than my small happiness from illegally downloading a movie? I think Mill would say probably yes. And that's why I didn't do it. So, it's not true that Mill neglects the rules. Now, of course, it is possible to find a scenario where the rule does conflict with the greater consequences, considering the long term as well, considering detriment done to the rule and harm done as a result of the detriment done to the rule. There may be cases where the rules do need to be broken, and I don't think Mill is saying otherwise. I'm not entirely sure Kant would either, and that's a subject for another video. The point here is, don't oversimplify it. Kant does not totally ignore consequences. Mill does not totally ignore the rules.